And we'll pull up the presentation here. All right. Mendel and the Scrums. For many of us, Scrums can be a little bit intimidating. There are very, very few of us. Self being one, I'm very proud of the fact that I used to play prep. But for most of us, we come to refereeing from the backs. So Scrums are a little bit impenetrable to us. And so what I wanted to do was kind of just break it down and say, really, there's only a few things that can happen. Yeah, there are tricks, there are strategies, there are lots of ways to play the Scrum, and it is an extremely cerebral part of rugby in so many ways. Take that however you will. However, there are some basics that I think makes it a little bit easier to understand. So how does a Punnett Square help us referee the Scrum? And for anybody that's not familiar, a Punnett Square is a thing used in genetics. So that's basically the joke that we're running through all night. Is if you remember back to high school biology, the idea is that you can take the parent and the other parent and you can figure out what they're going to make. If you have a yellow peas and you have green peas, you can figure out what the offspring is going to be. The idea is also that you have dominant and recessive traits. And we're kind of going to talk about that a little bit in terms of a loose head and a tight head. What we are focusing on here is the tight five, and we'll go into a little bit more when we talk about our second rows and our back row a little bit, but really the front row and the tight five is going to be our focus. And primarily, while the hookers and the second rows do have a role, primarily we're going to focus on the tight head and the loose head as the main drivers of what's going to happen in our Scrum. So thinking about what a Scrum is, Scrums will go in one of four directions. Thinking about it, they can go down, they can stand up, they can go forward, they can go backwards. Most of us have never really seen a Scrum walk sideways. They can kind of go sideways, but really we're going forward, we're going back, we're going up, we're going down. There's not a whole lot more variation that's happening there. The goal of every front row player and really everyone in a Scrum is to create pressure. We're creating pressure to make somehow we're applying pressure in the right spot, the right time, the right amount to make 8 people go in the direction that we want them to go. Now, the idea of trying to get 8 people on each side to work together in a way that produces that perfect Scrum is extremely difficult because everybody's going to have that little bit of variation. But applying pressure in a concerted way, we can usually get out of it with going in the same direction. When we're thinking about this pressure, it's causing a reaction. The beauty of the Scrum is that we are pushing on each other. So if I push, there's going to be a reaction. Somebody's going to go backwards, somebody's going to go forward, somebody's going to go up, somebody's going to go down. To step away from Mendel and look at Newton, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. That's what we're thinking about. So if somebody does this, his opposite number will do something. There's always going to be that reaction. Check quickly in the chat here. All right, moving on. So why are we having a Scrum? Yes, and if Gavin Hickey is listening in, God bless him, the Scrum is an extremely important part of the game. It is cerebral, it is a chess match, it is very important. But for many of us, Scrums break down to 3 basic things. They're a restart. They are a way to restart without sort of the penalty impact of a penalty, the idea that somebody's moving, somebody's gaining an advantage, somebody's potentially scoring points. A Scrum is a restart. It's creating space for open play, right? We're thinking about this new 50-22 as in you have to pull somebody to cover deep. It opens space, more people can run around. We have more action, we have more flow. When you put, of the 30 people on the field, 31 counting the referee, you put 16, 17, 18 of them all in the same spot, 19 of them counting the referee. You put them all in the same spot, that creates a lot of space for something to happen. So the idea is that you restart, concentrate a lot of people, you have opportunities to go wide, to go to space, to attack, create that dynamic rugby that we're all trying to make happen. Also, to build on a previous presentation, we talked a lot about referee tools and how we manage the flow of a game. Scrums are a great way to create that temporal space. Nobody in the world could sustain a rugby match that didn't involve at least a few stoppages, right? We'd all just quit after 20 minutes. And so that's the idea, is that we can use this as sort of a pressure valve and temporal space. Everybody takes a breather, we'll get ready, we'll start again. All right, so if we are looking at our opposite numbers here, let's see if I can make this a little bit smaller, make sure everybody can see here. The tight head is one part of this equation that's going to create pressure and cause a reaction. The tight head will apply pressure down and will apply pressure out. That's just the physics of it. They're going to go down, and then less often, but also possible, they're going to go out. The loose head on the opposite side, because again, the physics of the scrum, if you think about these interlocking pressures, you can literally make this happen just by, doing this with your fingers. The loose head will apply pressure up and apply pressure in and across. So those are our pressures. Again, the sort of the first one, the dominant expression, tight head's going to go down, loose head's going to go across. Those are the dominant things that everybody wants to do. It's their first option, and it's probably what you're going to see the most of. Very rarely are you actually going to see a tight head going out, but we'll talk more about that in a second. So before we move on and we get into the breaking down our Punnett squares, did anybody have any questions? All right, hearing none.
I've got a question.
Go ahead.
Are you saying this is what they naturally would do when you're just trying to shove in your legal direction, or are you saying this is what they would tend to do to try to put pressure on that could tend toward being illegal?
So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But basically what we're saying is that just based on the physics of the scrum, unless you are absolutely perfect and you are absolutely spot on and square and it's magnificent and nobody does anything, as soon as you get a little bit of a wobble, what's probably going to happen? Tight head's going to apply pressure down. Loose head's probably going to apply pressure across. That's just the physics of the scrum. So that's kind of what we're thinking about, is that's the outcome that can happen. So we'll talk more about it there, I promise. So here's our Punnett square. So we were looking a little bit at kind of what we talked about, sort of our dominant and our recessive traits. This idea that we can potentially combine them, and we're going to get one of 4 outcomes. Which for us as referees, when we're thinking about the scrums again can be this impenetrable thing, like what is going to happen, who did what, why did it go down, I don't really understand. And we actually, Mike and I have watched a lot of film on this. You'll see referees a lot of times, they give the cadence and they run away. They give the cadence and they head for the fullback, or they head for the fly half, and they just run away. And, we're always like, why do they do that? Why don't you stay, you referee the scrum? Because half of us, we don't really know what's going to happen. We're like, well, it went down. It's probably the loose head. And we don't really know why. So that's kind of what we're getting at, is this idea that we can break it down into one of 4 likely scenarios. And then if you just have a mental checklist of 4 things, then that makes it a lot less complicated. So in terms of goals, talking about what is the loose head trying to do? What do they want to do that is going to cause that going across or going up motion? It's probably going to end, unless they're good and they know what they're doing and they can control it. That pressure is going to happen. What are they trying to do? Well, the loose head is trying to find a platform to drive on. They want to be able to get a hold of that tight head and drive on them to be able to apply that pressure. Unfortunately, again, because of the physics of the scrum, the way that they're going to have to do that, naturally, they want to pull their hips out. They want to turn that shoulder a little bit, and that's what they want to do. They usually have to go across at least a little bit to even find that platform to drive on. Now, myself as a very tiny loose head, I did not have that problem. My problem was actually getting a bind on much bigger people, but normally the loose head is just trying to find a platform to drive on. The tight head, they want the loose head gone. They want to split that bind The more that loose head swings out, the more the tight head's like, yes, I got this. And they will try to split that bind and take the loose head out of the equation. Because if the loose head can't find a platform to bind on, essentially they've made the scrum 7 on 8. And in a situation where we're also thinking about a hooker, if it's a attacking hooker, they're going to have 1 foot up. They're not in a position to drive. Now it's almost, it could be 8 on 6. And then in an 8 on 6 shove possibility, there's going to be a lot of dominance expressed there. We're going to see that scrum do some moving. So again, defensive hookers may exert some pressure. Usually they're probably going to maybe go up a little bit. Offensive hookers, they're usually just taking up space and they're holding those props together. So the hooker is what keeps that prop in and keeps that bind tight that the opposing tight head is trying to split. So the overarching thing that I want to make 100% clear, the best way to deal with scrum problems is in the setup. We've talked about some tools in the setup, but I'm going to reiterate, the best thing you could do is make sure your hookers are offset, make sure that your spacing is good, make sure that your cadence is slow enough to identify problems before we get down to a bind call, basically. And then most of your problems will have been solved. It's always easier to solve these kinds of problems in the setup. That way the picture, when something does happen, is incredibly obvious. So moving on here. All right. In a situation where we have the tight head and the loose head are both applying pressure, we have this dominance. We have the tight heads kind of coming down, the loose heads kind of driving a little bit sideways, but they're trying to find that platform to drive on. That's actually really strong. That likely result is if you have 2 props that are just giving it all they got, and they're doing it in a way that applies equal pressure, we likely have a neutral result. Now, if somebody gets excited and that tight head applies too much downward pressure, scrum goes down. That's easy. If the loose head is more powerful, watch for the tight head to start leaning on them. Again, talking about that space, we want to keep everybody's heads apart at the bind call, lots of space on the bind call, no heads on shoulders. The World Rugby likes to call that preloading or early loading. If we don't have that, if we have that plenty of space, good distance on the bind, and then we come together on set, then we don't have this problem with the tight head leaning. Tight heads that are faced by pretty good loose heads opposite them will start to this thing where their legs get a little bit further back and they'll start leaning. And once they start leaning, their second row is leaning, their hooker is leaning, and they sort of bring the whole lot of the scrum to bear on that poor loose head opposite them. So if you see a tight head's feet creeping back, you know that tight head's getting beat and they're going to be trying to lean on their opposite number to create that extra dominance. So if you do have a situation, actually, let's go ahead and move on. I skipped ahead in my notes. All right, so here we have a situation where the tight head is exerting that downward pressure. The loose head is standing up a little bit. You see this a lot of times where their feet, you know, I really should have just brought somebody's Barbie doll. I need somebody with a Barbie doll. Ken, you got any Barbie dolls laying around your house? I don't think so. You have boys. I need a model here. I should have thought about that. So you have a loose head that their legs will stand up and their head will go down. And that's called hinging. That's sort of our classic hinge process. We'll see the legs go up and the head go down. A lot of times they'll do that just to get away from the pressure, right? Sometimes if you see it in a match where a referee has not asked for as much space on that bind call and you see the lean, even before the ball is in or right as soon as the ball is in, you'll see that loose head just drop the scrum. They want to get out of it. They don't want to be part of it. They see the lean. And a lot of times, you know, sometimes referees see that and they'll allow it. And then they'll just be like, well, can't hold your own weight, buddy. That's your problem. And they can identify that problem. Again, we're always looking for those feet on the tight head to be set a little bit too far back so they're not holding their own weight. Our outcomes here, if we're thinking about this situation, again, we have downward pressure from the tight head. We have a loose head trying to get away. If the loose head is positive, the tight head is leaning or applying downward pressure, we manage that tight head leg position. And then we're looking at possibly a free kick for potentially an early engage, right? If we see that heavy lean, we see the scrum move backwards a little bit, that's a free kick. Now, if the loose head is not taking the hit, Or if a loose head is just standing up, that's that negative play that we always want to avoid. That's also potentially a free kick opportunity. If the loose head is hinging after that ball is in, we really see a potentially dangerous situation, or it's impacting ball availability, or it's just incredibly obvious that he's doing it. That's a PK situation. So moving on. If we're thinking about a really dominant loose head that is trying to find that platform, they're getting a hold of it and they're driving across a little bit. We're thinking about that tight head who's maybe shearing off a little bit, maybe, possibly. Again, it's really difficult for a tight head to do this, but that is something that can happen. Likely result again here, probably neutral, right? If the loose head has found that platform, they've got a hold of them, they found that platform to drive on, they're probably not going to let them go too far. And so just let them drive, let them see what happens, force that tight head to do his or her job. So the tight heads potentially, they can also come back in a situation. We talked a little bit about that. If the loose head gets too far sideways, we start seeing that loose head bend out. Physics, again, the more that a bind between the hooker and the prop kind of goes like this, the more difficult it is for them to maintain that bind, the easier it is for a tight head to split that bind. So in a situation where a loose head has the ability to find that platform, drive on that platform, usually we're just going to let them. And then the tight head can take advantage of a loose head that gets too far sideways. Check the chat real quick. There are 2 tight head, loose head competitions in each scrum. Which are you talking about? That's an important point. We're talking about both of them, right? So it kind of doubles our workload. We're looking at both of these contests. And that's one of the reasons that we are trying really hard to simplify and think about there's only going to be essentially 4 outcomes, right? So that we multiply that. So we have to look at 8 possible outcomes here. We have 2 competing teams right here. They're going to apply pressure. So you could very easily have a situation where you have one thing happening on one side and one thing happening on another side. In that situation, you as the referee have to make the choice. You say which one is more impacting safety, structure of the scrum, ball availability, and then you go to that side. Honestly, if you start seeing trickery, if you start seeing, like we've all heard that expression, oh, it went down on that side, or if you get feedback from an assistant referee, it went down on this side. We're seeing an issue with the black tight head or the green loose head. That's the kind of information that you can use to triage those situations and say, okay, well, the open side isn't really giving me a whole lot of trouble. What I need to do is go over to the weak side. And you deal with it that way. So yes, really good point that we are having to watch both of these contests. Stephen, go right ahead.
Thanks, Greg. One thing that I was given some advice on, and I haven't totally wrapped my brain around it, but maybe you can help shed some light on it, which is what if I have a scrum situation where I can't figure out where the problem is to just take it one player at a time. So red is going against blue, scrum 1, focus on red tight head. If you're happy with what red tight head's doing, move on to blue loose head, just kind of systematically, just until you can kind of figure it out. I don't know what you think about that. I'm still wrapping my brain around that piece of advice.
So
Thoughts?
Some people really like to do that. For me, that is a process that takes a lot of mental energy and time. So usually what I am going to do is really focus on the open side, unless we're inside the 22. In open play, in a situation where we're not anywhere close to goal, we're probably going to just try to get that ball out. So what I need to do is focus on keeping the scrum stable long enough to get the ball out, to manage any problems and make sure that that quick ball is happening. So the idea is that I can set up the front row really, really well, make sure that setup is perfect. That way that quick ball can happen. And by the time that any problems become incredibly apparent, the ball's already away. When we get inside the 22, we start having people start to apply scrum pressure to a scoring opportunity. Then we have to start worrying about sort of the individual struggles. But by that point, you should have seen enough scrums. I mean, again, there are always going to be oddities, but normally we've seen a couple of scrums in the middle of the field. We've identified the problems. We can see, hey, we got away from that one, but this guy had a problem. Or we got away from that one, but I saw her standing up. I know that she's not taken the hit. I know that she's just, or I know that this is a situation where everybody's just leaning on each other and we're probably not going to have as much pressure. Like you can see those. So think about your opportunities in the open field, sort of between the 22s. Those are your opportunities to watch, to see what's going on. You have a little bit more grace and you know that everybody's probably just going to try to go to space there. Look at the identification. Again, I usually focus on the open side. And then when we get inside the 22s, hopefully we will have had a chance to observe and give ourselves a little bit more knowledge base. Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, I think you answered that pretty comprehensively. The one thing that I would say is that if you've got two really close scrums, then anything goes on any individual scrum itself. And once I was observing someone from an elevated view, and it was clear that it was just one of the players in the scrum who was always doing the same thing. And at halftime, I advised this person that they should look at that, and then they gave exactly the wrong penalty on the 5 meter line. And I was like, oh my God, I should have said nothing. So
Well,
just be careful.
I think that always goes back to never give a referee advice at halftime.
There's no absolute, and that's also a lesson that I learned that day. And there's no absolutes in trends in a game. You get a feeling, go with that maybe, but something can just go completely wrong and the opposite reaction happen.
Absolutely. And so again, these are sort of our tools. We're thinking about like who's trying to do what, right? If we know that the tight head is usually trying to just split those binds, we know, or basically put that downward pressure because they can focus the whole weight of the scrum on the tight head. So we know that if it goes down, we're probably looking at a tight head. If it goes sideways, across, up, and usually there's 9 other ways, or if there's a significant amount of time, very rarely do you see a tight head drop a scrum way late, right? Like very rarely do you see a situation in which a tight head is like, I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about it. Y'all drop it now. Usually because that doesn't really serve their interests, right? So thinking about those sorts of triggers in our head and then using our tools, like we said, the feet, I see the feet, they're really far back. This tight head is not holding their own weight. I know what they're trying to do. They're trying to apply that early pressure and then you can expose it. So you see it coming and then you can expose it. Again, that's one of our slow scrum cadence tools is that, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but a slower scrum cadence can force, right? Like that tight head is overextended. They're not holding their own weight. They may not be able to handle a 3 or 4 second cadence. Those are the kinds of things you can do. If you see the body position, you know what they're trying to do. Sometimes you can expose the problems and that way you're not feeling like, oh, I don't know what just happened. But so getting back to our Punnett Squares. So we talked a little bit about, this, we're thinking it's probably going to be a neutral result, right? This loose head is trying to find that platform. The tight head's kind of trying to get away from the pressure. They're going somewhere. Loose head's got them. They're going to drive. And as long as we have a situation in which, the loose head isn't too far sideways, in which case the tight head may take care of it by splitting the bind and solving their own problem, we can usually that's going to be a neutral result. Now, again, if we do have that very sideways situation in which a prop comes completely across, that's a PK situation, but usually a lot of other things have gone wrong before we get there. And another tool, I see it in my notes here. I just want to make sure I told you one of the things that I found very, very successful, especially if you have a situation where a loose head is seeking that platform, they're not able to find it. You have a tight head kind of standing back that is not actually engaging with what the loose head wants to do, and they're going looking for them. The flankers keep their hips in. Flankers are absolutely critical. Flankers have to push. Flankers have to do their job. And a lot of times, especially on a defensive scrum, flankers have their heads up. They're looking, they want ball out, and they've got what I call the fingertip bind, where they're lightly touching that second row, and they're not really paying attention to what's going on. Because again, the physics of it The flankers have to do their job to keep the props hips in, or that poor loose head, again, not necessarily through any faults of their own, but because that's the physics of it, is going to start swinging out. So, alrighty, moving on. So now we have a situation in which we kind of have two props that don't really want to do anything to each other, right? Loose head's kind of trying to get away, the tight head's kind of trying to get away. What we kind of have as a situation is either we're going down immediately, or we have a, let's just lean on each other kind of a situation. And we've all seen this, especially in some of our lower level games where folks haven't been playing in the scrums very often. They are quite happy to just take up space. They're just taking up space. They're waiting for balls out. And of course, especially in our high school matches, we see them. They just, I'll just hang out here. I'll hang out here, and then we'll go chase. We'll play rugby some more. So again, you have a situation here. We kind of have everybody's trying to get away from pressure. Now, importantly, as Pat Walsh mentioned, if we have a situation where they're reacting to pressure from somewhere else in the scrum, if we have a scrum, a tight head, loose head combination that are battling it out on the other side, their teammates may just be like, look, I'm trying to get away from that pressure. I don't know what's happening. The scrum is moving. There might be some sideways movement here. There might be somebody coming around. We've all seen it where the loose head kind of ends up coming around, and then everyone is trying to get away from their pressure. That may be a reaction to what's going on the other side of the scrum. But again, keeping the tight head's feet under them. If they engage and lean, that's fine. If everybody's still trying to get away from each other, we just free kick it, we get out of there. Quick question in the chat here. What about the number 8 popping their head up and still bound in? Sure, we can talk about that. Remind me when we get down to our back rows and our second rows. But yes, we definitely want to talk about that. All right. And then our final Punnett square here. Loose head's kind of pushing across. Oops, I went in the wrong direction here. Oh, okay, looks like we covered everything. We got all 4. I think we may have got all 4. All right, so again, basically you have a situation in which we have 2 props really going after each other. Somebody's going down, somebody's kind of coming across. That's fine. We might have one situation in which we have a loose head is really trying to find that platform, and the tight head that's kind of trying to get away from pressure. Let them. So both of those situations were neutral, we're vague, we're mostly positive there. If we have a situation in which tight head's kind of trying to come across and the tight head, they'll usually just exploit it, leave them alone. But, and we have a situation potentially where we have lean on me, and then we could also just leave them alone. Those are all examples of things that can happen that we as the referee, we're not just sort of running away from the scrum. We're looking at it, we're adjudicating it, and we're saying those 8 possibilities, we'll leave it alone. Now, if the pressure becomes too much on one side or the other, we've evaluated it, we've seen what's happening, we know one of those 4 things has happened, and then it got out of hand. So we saw it, we diagnosed it, and now we know what we're going to do about it. We're either going to potentially manage a tight head's feet, we're going to manage a flanker to keep some hips in, we're going to manage our setup process, and then potentially we can go to a free kick if everybody just wants to get away from it. If we don't see positive play from someone, we just get away from it with a free kick. And then if we actively see negative play from somebody, that's when we're going to the PK. And remember that we're going to focus on PKs after the ball is in. So, scrum adjudication process. Here's your mental checklist. Number 1, set up correctly. Setting up correctly, again, those tools that we talked about. We want to make sure that our hookers are offset. This is something that Mike and I have both tried to really focus on this season. It has been incredibly helpful to just make sure that those hookers are offset so we get the correct railroad tracks. Because if you don't have that and you don't have that good offset, a lot of times find props that are looking for their opening, and then all of a sudden the stability of your scrum is completely gone to pot. So if you can get those perfect railroad tracks, you can set that up correctly, good distance, good spacing. I tend to tell people that the scrum tunnel, I don't tell people, I tell baby referees, I never tell the teams, but I exist in that space. I will go put myself, the spacing should be about 1 gray wide. Some of us are wider than others. And I will put myself in that space when I set the mark, wait till the teams show up, and then I'll take a step out and I take a step back so that my personal bubble, what they're used to thinking of is like, I'm not going to get all up on top of the referee. That personal bubble quite literally sets the tunnel, and it's very helpful. That may work differently for other people. Some people like to sort of put in their arm. If they're a bigger referee, they'll kind of set the mark and like reach in and point to it. And that kind of, again, subconsciously puts that little personal bubble out there, and the teams will set up at a right distance. That's helpful. And then also slowing down that scrum cadence, but we'll talk more about that in a second. Craig, did you have a question?
Great. Are you giving them the left of the mark instruction? It's really prominent
people
now in
do.
international rugby.
Sorry, I'm sorry, I missed that last part.
It's becoming really prominent at the high levels of international rugby, left of the mark.
Yeah, some people do that. I haven't personally done that just because I haven't messed with it. But yeah, so we've definitely seen that. And a lot of people find it very helpful. Generally, the directive is that like everybody start paying attention to where the hooker's feet are. But yeah, some people find that left of the mark thing to be very helpful. I also like to mentally think about the hookers being offset about 1 cleat width wide. So that's also very helpful sometimes, sort of mentally be like, yeah, that's the right offset, is 1 cleat or about 4 inches. So let me just check the chat real quick. Yep, thank you, Ken. Exactly. So Ken, out of curiosity, which hooker would set the distance?
So the throwing inside sets the distance. So he sets the mark. And then I ask the hookers to work with each other to set the distance. So I guess I'll retract. The defending side sets the distance. But if I'm not happy with it, I'll ask the defending side to take a step back or forward as needed.
Okay. Yeah. And so that's a great process. We are always trying to sort of cut down on our words and our interactions with the teams. So if that's helpful for you, fantastic. Again, I sort of find it helpful to use subconscious body language cues. But I know a lot of people find success in having that communication and sort of, and that's very helpful to provide structure for some teams, especially our newer teams or our less skilled teams, if they have some direction, because they may not have that familiarity. They may not know that normally, you're right, it is the attacking side that is going to sort of assume the mark and set their presence, and then the defensive team can react to that. They may not have that level of familiarity. So yeah, it's really feeling out the teams.
Yeah, the number of words you use is completely dependent on the level you have in the front row.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially if you have more familiarity. Yeah. So awesome. So, and then slow cadence. So I actually did this. I went through and did a little exercise in which I clocked referees on their scrum cadence and in terms of ball out percentage, and spent a lot of time in Advantage sort of just clocking these referee scrum cadences. And if anybody was going to get 80% ball out or more, they had at least 3 to 4 seconds. Oh, sorry, 3 seconds. They had at least 3 seconds between their calls, directly correlated with 80% ball out or more. Just crouch, 1, 2, 3, bind, set. So between a 6 and 7 second scrum cadence is ideal, according to what I found out in my research. And then I went and fact checked that, looking at some World Rugby games, some Premiership games. I was clocking those referees as well. So again, we're always trying to quantify things, give people a number. That number seems to be correlating with the greatest percentage of folks who have successful scrums. And again, that's always ball out percentage. So if we're looking at 80% or above ball out percentage, it's people that have between a 6 and 7 second scrum cadence. Blow it up in the chat here. Let's look at that. Okay, we're having a lot of chat about left of the mark. So yeah, so the idea is that it doesn't have to be left of the mark, right? It doesn't have to be a situation where the attacking hooker is putting their foot left of the mark. What that is doing is quite literally creating that 4 inches of space that we talked about, that you set the mark as the referee. And if the attacking hooker goes to the left side, the defensive hooker has to go to the right side, and voila, we have kind of ended up with that more or less 4 inches of space. So that's the idea, is if you, the referee, have set the mark and the mark is your cleat wide, theoretically, right? You see the mark with your little foot. People like to give groundskeepers heart attacks. I always hate it when I see a referee like just jamming it in, because I'm like, oh God, the poor groundskeeper. But you've made a mark, right? And that mark is your cleat wide, 4 inches-ish. And then to the left of the mark, to the right of the mark, now you have that gap. So again, doesn't have to be perfectly left of the mark. It's just a good visual cue and a very helpful one. So looking for pressure. So now that we've set up correctly, we've checked our tight head's feet, which is an incredibly helpful tool if they are in a good body position. A lot of times you'll see, for some unfathomable reason, people like to really rock back on their second rows and they stick a leg out. They just put their leg, and they have one leg bent and one leg straight out. Whenever I see that, I'm like, ooh, I know they're not going to have a good body position when they get into their crouch, when they get to the point that they're going to be applying pressure, because there's no way that they're not going to be overextended when they start with that body position. So if you ever see a prop with an extended leg, you're like, I need to check their feet. Looking for pressure, when we have that slow cadence, crouch. We see props starting to wobble forward, we're like, hey, look, you got to hold your own weight, right? We see second rows applying pressure, come back. We see, usually that's all we're going to get on crouch. And then we're looking for bind. On bind, we want to keep that good space, keep that good distance. A lot of times on bind, we'll start to see applying pressure. A lot of times if you'll see a prop grab a hold of a collar and they'll do this on that long bind and they'll kind of turn their shoulder, they're applying that downward pressure. And that's something that we can identify. And we've seen it. We're like, that tight head's going down. What is the loose head going to do in response? And they will have done it on the bind call. You can see it on the bind call, whether that loose head's going to try to get away from the pressure. And you'll see that collar kind of like do this. They shouldn't be binding on the collars anyway, but because the jerseys are so slippery, a lot of times people bind on the back and it still stretches that collar. But if you do see them binding on the collar, adjust that. But if you see that loose head backing away, like it's very obvious that the loose head's going to try to get away from that pressure, or they're going to go after that pressure. You're going to see them kind of cock their heads and turn a little bit. You can see what they're going to do. So on that bind call, you know where the pressure exists and what it's going to do. And then you have the set call. And because you, again, have diagnosed one of your 4 situations, then you know what the pressures are. And then if there is an expression, if somebody does something, if you're like, ooh, I identified, we had a tight head putting a lot of downward pressure. And then as soon as the ball comes in, there goes the scrum. I know who did it. I know it was that loose head who was backing away from him. So you've already diagnosed the problem. You know what's happening. And you know that the legal dominance wasn't there, that the loose head stood back, they stood away, they didn't take the hit. That's not legal dominance. That's actually negative play. That's what we're saying here, is that, again, we can identify, we can go through this process, and you, because you're brilliant referees, will have diagnosed one of those 4 situations for each loose head, tight head team by the time that we get to the set call. So by the time you get to the set call, you're like, yep, I know what's going to happen, or at least have it narrowed down to a very, very tiny list of possibilities. So, et voila. All right. So we've all heard this phrase, it's usually the loose head. Why is it usually the loose head? Because the tight head's usually easy to see when they're doing something. Honestly, a lot of times we'll say the tight head, or, oh, it's got to be the loose head. The loose head's doing something. So I was happy with the tight head. That's a fair statement. If you're happy with the tight head, you know who else to blame. And also, it's usually easy to see when that tight head is applying significant downward pressure, that they are stretching that collar, that they're really cranking down, that their shoulder is up, their elbow. If you see the elbow go up, you know exactly who it is and what they did. So it's very easy to see when that tight head is applying a lot of downward pressure. If it's not that, there are things the loose head can do. And there are a few more ways that loose head can get a little tricksy. So what we want to think about is that you make the loose head engage, keep their bind. If you see a loose head's bind slipping, you know what's happening. When their loose head's bind is slipping, it means that they're starting to do this, right? So you make the loose head engage, take the hit, keep their bind, keep the tight head's feet back. Don't let them apply all the way to the scrum onto that poor loose head. And you have a beautiful scrum. So, whoop, click the wrong button here. Keep clicking on the wrong side. All right, so back to everybody else in the scrum. There's a bunch of other people around. Yes, the front row is critically important. However, there's other people around. Second rows, they can split or they can be split. By the very nature of second rows, if there is a lot of pressure on that front row, the second row will tend to come through because the points of drive are coming from the behind and they're coming from the front. And that's when you see a front row kind of get bent in half. Sometimes this happens, especially the loose head is trying to get away from pressure and they have a gung-ho second row. You'll see that loose head just kind of fold up. And so that's what you want to think about, is that the rows, if you're seeing the rows splitting, that means there's a ton of pressure on that scrum. And you're also probably seeing the scrum either fold, go backwards, or they can be split, right? If you have that good tight head who's going to split that props bind, they're going to keep working their way through the scrum. And as soon as that first bind starts to go, that second bind starts to go, it completely discombobulates the pressure in a scrum. And instead of this, we have this. And so that's what you think about it in second rows. Like, they're not doing a whole lot. You can see what they're doing, but remembering that if you see them splitting, there's a lot of pressure. If you see them being split, the pressure's coming from the other side, right? They're coming across. Flankers have to push. We talked about this. We talked about flankers, that they have to pay attention. They have to do what they're supposed to do. And thank you again, Eric, for, yeah, we got to talk about the 8-man, right? So when we say bind, bind means you have a shoulder in. Bind means your hands closed and your shoulders in. So at least in general terms, as far as I'm concerned, hands closed, shoulder in. We have an 8 that's popping their head up and looking around. Well, theoretically, as long as their shoulders are in, I'm not too mad about it, but they've just taken a man out of the scrum. So if that 8 is pulling her weight off the scrum, she knows that she's getting driven back. She's just looking to salvage this because she can get out quick. As long as it's safe, I'm not too mad. As long as she stays bound in, that's okay. We have a situation where they're really only hurting themselves at that point. Same thing with the flankers. If they're not paying attention, their props hips are all over the place. They're drawing a penalty for their prop, and they're really not helping in terms of keeping that scrum stable to get themselves a good platform to go after the fly half. They're giving the other team all the advantages they could want because they've taken up to 3 people out of that scrum equation. So even if you were the best prop in the entire world, that tight 5 is the best in the world. If they do not have 2 flankers and an 8-man, there's not a darn thing they can do against a full 8-pack on the other side. So a lot of times, if you have a situation where you have flankers, you have 8s that are kind of playing games, they're usually only hurting themselves. As long as we're not seeing something like a launch, we have, a lot of us, it was a very fashionable thing for a while that 8s would kind of do this thing where they sat back and they hung on like they were, riding a jet ski or something, or water skiing, and then they would launch themselves. They would try to get that extra hit. That's part of what the set call is designed not to do, that they're not going to have that kind of launching power. And if you see that, they obviously didn't have their shoulders bound on bind. That's easy to deal with. So we don't want that launching to happen. It completely disrupts the scrum. It's very, very dangerous. So if you see that, just say, hey, look, I need your shoulders bound on bind call, and we can all go about our days. Hear me roar. This is something that I feel like we have to coach baby referees in a lot of times, is that especially those who have gone through the 7s program, everybody wants to sort of have a conversation at the scrum and they're just like, crouch, bind. I'm like, no. You got to like sing from your gut, like breathe from your kidneys and say it, because a lot of times, especially those second rows, they can't hear you. They're hearing through thighs. They're hearing through a scrum cap. Sometimes it's hair. Like I used to wear a scrum cap just to keep my hair in. They can't hear you. And that creates problems in terms of being able to execute their scrum plan. So give your calls clearly, give your calls loudly, and just boom across the field. You don't need to scream. Doesn't need to be, an aggressive situation, but just use your stage projecting voice because they may not be able to hear you through thighs and a scrum cap. So All right. That is our presentation on Punnett Squares and the Scrum. Any questions? Yeah, some are really hard of hearing. I mean, honestly, I used to have a lot of fun when I would go over to a school for the deaf and I could use my hand signals to set the Scrum. That was kind of neat. So any other questions on our basic Scrums? Again, we're trying to work on this diagnosing these 4 outcomes. This is what's going to happen, theoretically 8, right? Because you have 2 sets, but who's causing the pressure, who's responding to the pressure, diagnose the situation, and then when ball's in and something goes wrong, you knew where to start. So. If 8 picks up, the defending scrum half can try to tackle the 8. Did the defending scrum half start from an onside position? That is the question. Is as long as that defending scrum half, yeah, defending scrum half started from an onside position, ball's out, right, at that point. So that's fine. The critical part there is starting from an onside position. All right, guys. Well, that said, let's move on. Let's move on to our other, oops, we have a question. Could a defending scrum half even see the ball? Then that is an excellent question. Sometimes they have X-ray vision. Normally the cue would be basically if they're looking at the 8 and they see them drop their bind, that would be their cue. And they have to get that timing right. But yeah, if I was playing 9 and I could see the other 8, all of a sudden their hands went from here and they disappeared, I knew they were going for an 8-man pick. Or you also learn the calls, right? Like all of us as referees, we figured out every team's calls by the time we get to like the first or second line out or the first or second scrum. So usually if they're like, rhino, 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 and I'm like, that's an 8-man pick. I'll just go. And if I figured it out, the other team figured it out. So anyway. We'll jump over to our second presentation here. And of course it's not, there we go. All right. And welcome to the second half of our feature. Who does what? There's a lot going on in a referee society. Sometimes it's a little impenetrable. So wanted to quickly run through, we have a president, we have an allocator, an RDO, secretary, treasurer, and lots of other stuff that is not always incredibly clear and apparent to people that may want to be involved, or that you just participate in the referee society and you're like, I don't know who to talk to about this issue. Hopefully this will help. So the president, there are rules, Smokey, bylaws. President represents the society. The president helps out the board with their jobs. The president is the deciding vote on policy matters. Now, what the president does not do, the president is not ruling by fiat. There is an executive board. We have a committee. We all talk about stuff. That is an important component of this, that the president is not the king or the benevolent dictator. The president is someone who is there to help, to be the deciding vote, and to represent the society to other societies or to USA Rugby or really anywhere we in need of a public presence. So that's what the president does. It's a lot less hands-on than most people think. A lot of people think that the president is really involved in the day-to-day and everything that everybody's doing. Not so. The president says, I'm available to help you. I am available to be wisdom and guidance. I am here. I'm familiar with the bylaws. I have opportunities to say, appoint people for help, or I can make a committee, or we can study an issue. But they're really not the hands-on kind of person unless they're asked by that board member. So the president is the smiling face, shaking hands, kissing babies, and they are sort of the deciding vote. That's what they do. All right, RDO. The RDO is basically the vice president in some ways, right? They often serve in a VP role. A lot of times when you have these LRO gatherings, you have the president, and then you have the RDO is the second in command. They're also attending, like the MAR meetings, for example, like their board, the governing board of MAR is made up of presidents and RDOs. So That's an important component. They are sort of the right-hand person for the president. Also, the person behind the curtain, they are steering referee careers from brand new to C2. After that, sort of the high performance world takes over. But from brand new to C2, that is the referee development officer's job, is to get people from their L1 to a point where they can pretty much handle anything we're going to see in the society. And then for some of the folks that are maybe outside the high performance world, to help them get to their goals, because at that point it comes to a situation where a referee understands their needs, kind of says, this is what I want to do, this is where I want to go, I have a good sense of what I want to be as a referee. The RDO's job is to deal with that. They work extremely closely with the allocator and with recruitment, because it is their job to know all the information about referees. They are supposed to know, what's your favorite color, what cleat size do you wear, where are you going with your season, what do you want to do? And they have that information that they can feed to the allocator that they're getting from recruitment. Have a great Thanksgiving. Glad you could be here. All right, allocator, feed on the tears of our enemies and drag them down to the murky depths. That is the alligator. Sorry. The allocator schedules referees, deals with the teams, feeds offenders to the alligator. The allocator needs to have an in-depth knowledge of teams, matchups, referees, and they have to be one of the most patient people on the planet. They work with the RDO to meet development goals. They have a situation where they're like, okay, this referee really needs to be challenged on management, but not so much on pace. Let's put them on this match. That'll be a good test for them. Hey, we have a situation where we have a lot to cover this weekend. We have a bunch of games that are co-located. Okay, cool. I'm going to put this referee there. They're going to stay and they're going to coach the referee in the next match. So this referee is going to be here. They're going to go there. And it's this moving chessboard of all of the things that are going on to try to get everyone to their goals. The allocator is the one who's usually catching crap directly from the teams. Why did you assign us this referee? How dare you? Or I don't have a referee. I'm like, well, I'm really sorry you put your match in on Friday. Like, that's what the allocator does. And I know we've had some questions about Ref Up. Ref Up is a new system that basically, because we didn't really have anybody that wanted to be the allocator, we really have had, because of various things, people have stepped back. We haven't had a ton of people training as administrators, and it's a really, really tough job that requires a lot of expertise. Ref Up is something that kind of came in that allows a little bit more flexibility for the allocator. The idea is that Ref Up allows a lot of referees to self-select. So if you have folks that are in that place that we talked about, that they know where they want to be, they know who they are as the referee, they can kind of self-select and figure out what they want to do, what works for them. Then the allocator has 70% of their workload taken away. That 30%, they can really drill down, focus, talk to the RDO, talk to the recruitment folks, and help the people who are trying to move up, the people that are trying to learn, and then the people that are just starting out. They can really focus their attention on those people. That was the goal with Ref Up. We are still working out some kinks, but honestly, considering poor Patrick had never actually done any kind of allocations before, that was a huge leg up for him. So I think we're, again, still working out the kinks with Ref Up, but that was the goal, was to sort of take some of the absolutely crushing work off of the allocator, and sort of create those opportunities for them to learn and grow as well, and really focus on certain referees. So yeah, so that was the idea, is that the allocator, it can be this position that requires you to know all and be all. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. We can work out some tools. I actually am at this moment beta testing a program to help allocators as well. It's basically like, put in this information, here are the match levels, here's the teams, here's the referee, this is what I want for the referee to get out of this, and boom, here's the match you should assign them. So we're actually beta testing a very basic program to do that, that can be an additional tool for an allocator. All right, secretary keeps things from falling apart. Secretary makes people show up to meetings, makes us actually have our meetings. I can't tell you how many times poor Vince has been like, guys, we actually have to have a meeting. Like, I'm sorry, there's somebody's always going to have a conflict, but we need to have a meeting. Writes it all down, gives people homework, manages the website, keeps track of records. We had a whole saga about the Instagram password. Don't even worry about it, but they know where the bodies are buried. They know where everything is. They make the cheat sheets. They make sure that there are smooth transitions. That is a major part of the secretary's job, that there is a smooth transition between administrations and that we don't lose paperwork, we don't lose institutional knowledge, because sometimes our allocators quite literally move to France and we need to be able to have a transition. So secretaries keep all that kind of stuff together. That's right. You just be the greatest of all time. That's who you are. That's awesome. All right, recruitment, straightforward, but not easy. We have at least one recruitment officer in here. I think Buzz is still with us, and Buzz can tell anybody it is not easy to convince people that you should be a referee. Again, Ken, you were also recruitment. Not easy to do. You know, you got to tell people that like, it's fun to catch crap every Saturday, like just yay. And somehow they do that. And L1s are their jam, and they work very closely with the allocator and the RDO to kind of get those new referees off the ground. They also liaise with USA Rugby Education and the educators like Ken, who will be coming to teach those courses, kind of making them aware of like, here's what our needs are, here's who's going to be there. They are that liaison. They're relentlessly positive people, and for that, we appreciate them. Treasurer, the money people, they handle a lot of competing interests, a lot of competing needs. Fortunately, in Potomac, they have a pretty swell gig in terms of resources. Other societies are run on a shoestring, and the treasurer is the person who somehow keeps everybody solvent and finds money for that plane ticket to Texas for that exchange. Ken, that's super exciting. Let's make sure we tell everybody about that before we leave. So treasurer, they handle the money. Important people. Training officer. What you're looking at right now, sometimes you got to teach to learn. You got to be somebody that's dialed into whatever USA Rugby is trying to get across to the LROs. You got to be dialed into the high performance world, trying to figure out how to meet the needs of your people. But you're also really trying to teach community referees that have been teaching, that have been refereeing rugby for maybe 20 years. Like, what could I possibly teach them? I don't know if you guys have noticed, but one of the things that I try really hard to do is steer away from some of the traditional topics, try to steer away from some law and interpretation, and kind of go at the psychology of rugby, learning, here are the things that we might not have thought about in 30 years of, our careers, our experience. If we might just do it intuitively, and so much of rugby and teaching and education is based on, you'll just get a feel for it. You need to, get some experience, you'll get a feel for it. And that's what I've tried to do really well, is codify, what is that feeling? What is that experience? And how can we shorten these learning curves? Because we have a situation where we have so few referees that we really need to be able to get people up to speed in 2 years. It used to be 5 years. You kind of have this arc up to like a C1 level, a 5-year arc. We're going to cut that down to 2 years. Brand new to C2 and 2 is my motto, but then they went and changed the referee levels on me. So anyway, the idea is that you got to be able to gather all these things, digest it, and then spit it back out at your referee society, and they have to be able to get something out of it. Communication skills plus. Don't know if I'm scoring on that, but thank you guys for being here. All right. We are a team too. So the folks that I've told you about, these are the officers that Potomac has. We're a team. We care very much about our product, our team in terms of like the executive board, our team in terms of the referee society as a whole. We care about the teams and our larger rugby community. We care about rugby, and we are a team of people that is doing this because we love it. So I feel like that's an important point to make, because sometimes when it's really hard and you've got a lot of work to do, we can forget about that. So, all right. And I think that brings us to, here we go. Somehow I managed to skip a couple of slides. I don't know why. Some other referee societies have other officers. They have, some people have IT and video, especially for societies that really rely on video. Webmaster, Ashley has really stepped up for us and been taking over the redesign of the website. I don't know if anybody's seen the new website, but it's magnificent. Some folks have an exchange officer. A lot of referee societies have what's called an ombudsman, and this is something we got from the teams. The teams, a lot of times there's leadership, right? Like there's the coaches, there's the captains. It may be really hard for somebody who's new, or maybe feels like they don't know who to go to, they don't know where to go, they might have something that they think could potentially hurt selections, they go to the ombudsman. They say, look, I have a concern. And that ombudsman can take that to the board in an anonymous way. There's a little bit of distance. The ombudsman can also field these kinds of things. Ombudsman, I think, is a very useful position. There's a vice president sometimes, and there's an events committee. We have events committees going right now for our banquet and going for the AGM. High performance liaison, Jake still is sort of serving in that role, that he is representing the LROs in our area and also the Northeast in New York to high performance folks. And then something I'm gonna float it out there that we brought up at our last meeting is thinking about potentially appointing a U19 committee as an idea to potentially help us train some administrators and to potentially take some workload off of the executive board. And so some societies do this where they'll have a U19 person or a U19 committee of one of several people that can potentially take over some of that, helping to train U19 referees and being a liaison for them to the rugby, to the referee community, helping to work with U19 teams. Zinzan did an amazing job with this in Baltimore with the MIAA, where he was sort of their community liaison and sort of building a coalition. He was the first one to be able to talk to the teams, knew the communities intimately, and then potentially U19's allocator, right? So it's not a ton of games. You can basically work from January to July through the spring season. It's administrative light, and you have a lot fewer games to worry about, and you can kind of learn how allocations works in a very low stakes environment. So that's an idea for Potomac that's sort of being floated. No commitment, absolutely none. We are totally in the talking stage. But I thought I would mention it in case that really strikes someone's fancy, that they're like, hey, I think U19 allocations would be a good place to start for me. I think a U19 community liaison would be a great position to start for me. I think maybe an ombudsman would be a great position, representing our community referees, because sometimes our executive board can get kind of caught up in the pressure from USA Rugby and the high performance world, representing our community referees and their needs. Those are the sorts of things that we could potentially add, because there is a need to kind of take some of the weight off the executive board. So, all righty. Thanks, Lataro. Really appreciate that. Fantastic. All right. So again, if you have any interest in any of this, there are a couple of different ways that you can be involved. You can run for office. We do this every year at the AGM. You could be present at the AGM. You can see how the process works. You can throw your name in the ring. There is a response form that will be going out shortly. If you would like to go to the AGM, go ahead and fill that out. And that way we'll know to plan for lunch is the most important thing, and who your proxies are if you plan on voting. And then if you want to run for office or nominate someone for office, you can shadow someone, offer to help. People will say yes. If you want to serve on a committee, committees are a great place to get your feet wet, and then just come, attend, hang out, get a sense for how things work. So that is the very brief presentation on referee societies and how they function. The AGM Society Banquet, thank you, Buzz. Fantastic. So Buzz has let us all know Saturday, February 19th is the date to put on our calendars. Save the date, most likely in Arlington, but taking suggestions. That's fantastic. AGM date, as far as I know, is not set. Vince is helping to organize that. He is unfortunately traveling. He's in Japan this week, but expect information on that very, very soon, as he gets back this weekend. So I see votes for Arlington there. I don't mind voting for Arlington as well, since I'm coming from the South. So, and then Ken, did you want to share information about the L1?
Yeah, I'd love to. We just had this set to within the last couple of hours. Ryan Caldwell has been very active in trying to make this happen. And we just got confirmation this evening that St. John's will be hosting. The L1 will be set on January 22nd. And quite honestly, I don't know if that's a Saturday or Sunday. but we're hoping for just a large attendance, and we're trying to focus this on not just in one group of people, but we're trying to get everything from youth referees to senior referees, get everybody there. And I love the U19 focus you just had right there, like trying to get somebody on the allocation side, because we're going to really push to get more than the 6 youth referees have going right now. We're trying to get about a dozen or so for the spring to help support that program. So when Vince gets back into the country, I'm hoping to work with Ashley on creating some sort of social media flyer that we can push out to everybody. So please stay tuned for that. So again, January 22nd, St. John's. Don't know who the educators are going to be at this point. I'm assuming Tom's going to be one of them because he's going to be the host as well. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thanks, Ray.
Awesome. All right. Well, I will go ahead and stop sharing, and I will go ahead and